Five, four, three, two.
Welcome to Power of the Tribe with John Connors. Hi, my name's John Connors. I'm the founder and head instructor of Connors Martial Arts here in Norwood, Massachusetts. We teach Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai kickboxing, and mixed martial arts. And what we're talking about in our podcast is the power of the tribe. If you want to make a major transformation in your life, you want to become more confident, you want to get in great shape, you want to lose weight, whatever positive change you want to make in your life, it's going to be that much easier to do if you find the right supportive tribe. Power of the tribe. And I'm here with my co-host, Dan Robin.
How you doing, John?
Good. How you doing, buddy?
Amazing.
Dan, I thought it would be interesting today to talk to you about your experience in martial arts when you decided you wanted to join your tribe, make a change in your life.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I thought about this a lot, too, because I thought, well, maybe you could correct me if I'm wrong, but my thinking was this, that like a lot of guys like yourself that started gyms, and it doesn't have to be a martial arts gym. It could be someone starting a basketball league or a yoga gym or anything. They kind of come from a place where it's their comfort zone. That might not be true, and we can talk more about your background later, but they might not realize how hard it can be for someone to go from a completely different sort of background into something like martial arts. So you can be like someone like myself had no combat sport experience at all when I started.
Now, how old were you, Dan?
My 30s. Well, okay, so I was going to say my very first experience was my 30s, other than sort of remembering on the spot. Here's
Okay, let's set the stage. You're in your 30s.
Yeah.
What made you decide that you wanted to do something like this? Where were you in your life? What was happening?
Well, I was just in my 30s with like 3 kids and a suburban dad.
Suburban dad. You're still
So
kind of suburban dad.
I still am. Yeah. but it seemed like not only was I not doing combat sports or had experience in combat sports, I wasn't doing sports at all. Like I always
Right.
kind of kept somewhat fit, ran a little, lifted a little weights, but I wasn't doing any sports.
You have good genes. You seem like you're always like relatively fit looking.
Yeah, I don't really tend to balloon up.
You have kind
almost
of
seeming no matter what I do.
Right. You have like a trim dad bod
Yeah, exactly.
at the worst. Little muffin top, but not a big beer belly.
And that's with like at the worst. Yeah.
So you're in your 30s. You're wearing your Bermuda shorts. You're flipping burgers in the backyard. You're the suburban
Yeah.
dad.
So I'd always, the one thing I'll say I had that I'm not sure if other people had, I was always curious about martial arts. And I almost don't get how any guy can't be somewhat curious. Like, growing up, it was pre-UFC. You grow up and you'd think, what are these things? There's Kung Fu and there's
Oh, right.
Taekwondo and there's karate. And that's what was so engaging about the first UFCs, of people saying who will actually win in this fight.
Yep.
That it really caught my interest and a lot of people's interest to see, what are these things? How do they work? Like,
when I was a
mysterious
kid,
for them.
if somebody had a black belt in karate, they were basically a superhero. They were invincible.
We'd whisper about kids in our high school
Yes.
with a black belt.
He's
It was
got a
like,
black belt.
but if you can remember that far back, it was still a mystery. It would be like, I remember a kid in my high school with a black belt, and it would be like, he can do a backflip. Like totally like irrelevant things like that. You know what I mean? It'd be like, I saw him do a backflip once. And
There was a guy from my town, my area, who was legitimately a badass. He was the first person with a six-pack that I've ever seen in my life. People don't realize now, everyone's running around these gyms with six-packs, eight-packs. They're just ripped abs. Back in the 70s, there was no six-packs. I think Bruce Lee was the only person on the planet with a six-pack. And this guy, Gary Eblin, he had a six-pack, and he was legitimately a bad, and he still is. He's a great guy, and he was a legitimate badass. Yeah.
But mostly it was like whispered about. You didn't sort of get it, and everyone was sort of uncomfortable. It was sort of like, could the big football player beat the karate guy? And like nobody knew what it was.
Oh,
and like,
right,
what's
right.
Kung Fu? And so the one martial art I did was in college. I took either a semester or 2 semesters of Kung Fu.
Okay.
Did you know I had a Kung Fu background?
I could tell the way you walk.
Yeah,
you walk across rice paper without leaving any impressions
and
on it.
Yeah, I could at any moment in the gym break out my Kung Fu.
That's it. You have a very circular way of moving. I noticed that.
But so it was literally like the big reveal at the end of the year was like the instructor told us what animal we were. Like it was
Let
that
me
kind
guess,
of kung
let
fu.
me guess. Was it some bird?
It was not a bird.
Not a bird. I was thinking
Cooler.
a crane.
Cooler.
But, cooler.
Yeah, I didn't
Oh,
want
right. Of course, he's going to give
I
you
didn't
something
want to be
cool.
the crane.
Tell me.
The snake.
The snake. I should have known. I should have known. You are a frickin' snake.
Yeah.
I should have known that.
I don't think it was based on personality.
No.
I think it was just how I struck.
You
man.
struck.
I
Oh.
just struck. Like, but they
A
were
lot
all
of
like,
acceleration.
but it was
Bam.
all like, he'd be like, "You're a dragon." To like, it would be like, because the dragon is unpredictable, and it'd be like, "You mean uncoordinated?" Like, someone would just like flail
Spastic.
across the room, and it would be like, "That's a dragon."
You're a
there.
dragon. You
Yeah.
have a rare spastic quality to your movement.
Tiger, dragon. So the only reason, so that's my only thing I did, and again,
What kind of snake? Did they specify?
they
It must
did
be a
not say.
cobra, right?
It was just a general. I honestly think he was like going down the line, and he got to me, and he barely remembered who I was, and he was like, snake. Like I don't know, it's kind of like thin, and
He ran
know,
out
like,
of other animals.
he's
Yeah.
like, I don't know, like a bigger person gets tiger. You're kind of skinny. It's like I think that's how I remember him saying it. Is like,
He's like,
snake.
yeah, you're a
Snake.
dangerous, impressive
move-
animal of some sort.
yeah, moving on. And so it was just like the one thing I knew at the time. So one thing it shows is that I was curious. Like I took it because I was curious.
Right.
And secondly, I knew it wasn't right. Like I knew I was like
You knew what wasn't right, Dan.
that the kung fu was not right, that I did not learn how to fight.
You didn't learn how to fight.
I was like, I know that this would not help me in a fight.
Right. You felt like if you were in a bar room and shit went down, your snake-like abilities probably weren't going to help you.
I would not be able to like windmill my arms in some kung fu
Right.
way. And but I'll give you another example. I knew it wouldn't work for anyone else in the room. Like there'd be some guy like one semester ahead of me, like uber sort of nerd kind of personality, but he had one semester ahead of me, so he'd be sort of like, you're doing that wrong.
That's very funny. I took, I think, 4 months of karate training when I was about 14 or 15, I think. I can't remember. It was called American Combat Karate, and it was actually some real legitimate fighting, man, for back then. And
Yeah.
we did real sparring. And I think I got to orange belt or something, and then I was allowed to spar, which was pretty quickly, actually. It was only 4 months. I got a couple belt promotions, and I had to spar this purple belt. And I was like, holy shit, I'm going to spar a purple belt. Holy cow, what am I going to do? And we had our little booties on, like little footsie foam things over the feet. And we had, I think the gloves were almost like MMA gloves. They weren't like big 16-ounce boxing gloves.
Yeah, I had
And
some of those.
We
There's, like,
probably we
karate
didn't have any
sparring gloves.
headgear. So then I sort of faked a low kick to this, and they didn't teach us to do this. It was just my instincts. And the purple belt, he lowered his forearm to block my low kick in the pattern that they taught us, and then I just windmilled like a hillbilly overhand right, and man, I cracked this poor kid right in the face, and he staggered backwards. And then I was shocked. I said, he's a purple belt. And I landed that punch. How the heck did that happen? And then the instructor stopped it, and he said, well, he's being a little sneaky. So he insulted my technique. He's like, I'm being sneaky. Like, that's a bad thing in fighting.
Like
to be
the feint
sneaky.
was sneaky.
Yeah, it was sneaky.
And I think that's one thing. There's so many things we take for granted now, but back then we didn't know, and we, were completely oblivious to it, which is that you have to spar to learn. Like you have to spar.
Right, you got it.
So like the kung
Right.
fu, there was no legit sparring. Like
I think that's a very key point, Dan, because I still hear guys today. I don't have these conversations, but I overheard a conversation a year ago. This guy was explaining to this young woman who was trying to impress, which is usually how these conversations are going. And the martial art that he trained was so deadly that they couldn't spar, and he wasn't allowed. His instructor could not go into mixed martial arts because, for God's sakes, he'd be killing people. And
people still talk that way.
they
This
do,
happened recently?
and that's fine. I don't mind that. But here's the one that cracks me up. They go, those professional MMA fighters, their training would work against them in the street. Like they would actually get themselves into trouble. And they parcel out this nonsense to people, usually to some young woman they're trying to impress who doesn't know any better. She's like, "Oh wow, what you're doing is so deadly," and those poor professional mixed martial artists are just going to get their ass kicked in the street. Which is, I mean, John Jones could go into a bar and literally fight probably 10
Finish the
guys
whole
and
bar.
murder all of them with his bare hands. Yeah.
Or take it away from MMA. Think of like Mike Tyson. Be like, oh,
Right.
that'll work against him.
That'll work
in the
against
first-
him because
he
he's
gets
going to
destroyed.
follow the. Somebody's going to ring a bell and he's going to think the round is over.
Yeah,
He's
they're
going to
throw a bottle at him. He's going to think the range is determined by fists, and someone's going to have a bottle and have
Right,
an extra
right.
6 inches.
Well, there is something to it. Like if somebody stabs you, you basically don't want to be getting in any fights anywhere if
of
you can
course.
avoid it, of course.
But the idea that it doesn't work, or that I thought, like we used to hear that all the time. I guess it still exists. It's just we're not in that world of like
Right.
the deadly art. Like my guy can't be in the UFC because he'll break every. But if you remember when UFC started, we didn't know if that was true. We thought it might be true. It
Thought
might
it
be
might
like
be
maybe
true.
there's people that are just going to kill everyone.
Well, you got to use a
At
little
least I
common
didn't know.
sense,
Maybe
but-
someone knew.
Right, right. People like to believe things. There's some stories that have a quality that people want to believe it, and they'll believe it and they'll pass it on. Before the internet, Dan, you must remember before the internet, there was a thing called urban legends.
Yeah.
So there were these stories that were passed around pre-internet that were just word of mouth stories that people would tell each other. I think
Yeah.
I think I took a course actually in my freshman year at Harvard that was about urban legends. We called it a gut course. You know what I mean? You pretty much got an A. It was a lot of fun. But one of the things was if you palm strike somebody in the nose, you're going to drive their nose bone
Yeah, I
into
think
their
we all
brain,
heard that, yeah.
and you'll kill them.
Yeah.
And I bet you there's people out there today that believe this.
But when I first started looking into, so way back when, looking into martial arts, I saw some of these things that were like the shortcuts, right? Like, how do you just defend yourself in a street fight and win in this one move? Or like,
Right.
here's 2 moves. And it'd be like a palm strike to the nose is what used to
Right.
be. Like,
Then if you think about
so
it,
you don't have to study for years. You just,
do you know anybody who died by their nose bone going into their brain by some accidental freak movement? So it has to be the palm. What if a boxer punches somebody in the
Yeah.
nose? Why haven't I ever heard of anyone dying by their nose bone going into their brain? Car accident, fall,
But
never has happened.
it's actually interesting. And like, because I don't know if you had this same feeling about the early UFCs, but what I remember is the first thing is it was amazing. You were like, is this even legal? Like they're allowed
Very
to
exciting.
fight? Like,
Yeah.
is it real? Is this
Right.
fake? And then it was very exciting. But then like UFC 3, UFC 4, for a while, I was almost like not directly, but indirectly wondering if like some ancient kung fu guy was going to like come out of the mountains. You know what I mean? Be like,
yeah.
I've heard of this tournament, and just like do his, his magic, the
Right.
spinning kicks, and just be like, wait, like UFC's big enough that it drew in this magician, this guy that's just incredible. It's like, is someone going to appear? And then by UFC 5, somewhere around 5, it was like, there's no one like that.
Well, I think
and it was almost
well-
like a letdown in that it was like, wait, so the best fighters, the toughest guys are like wrestlers and it was sort
I
of
think
like
Coyce Gracie
Yeah.
sort of played that part, though. He kind of
Yeah.
came out of nowhere, and at least in my mind, maybe not in Brazil, and he was such a baby-faced looking guy, and for him to beat these big guys and these scary-looking guys,
He
that
was
was a
working magic.
revelation.
because
Yeah.
the thing is, he'd get someone in a triangle and everyone would be like, you'd see him tap out and you'd be like, what did he even
happened?
do?
The commentators didn't even know what
Yeah.
was going on half the time.
He
Yeah.
just gave up, and it was like, why did he give up? What
It di-
happened?
It did seem like magic. It was really amazing. So back to your
Yeah.
story. So you're in
So
your
other-
30s. You're
Other than my kung fu background.
you got your kung fu background.
So-
How long? That was in college.
Yeah, so years.
semester or
this is
something?
years and years later.
But to your point, I think almost all men. Well, let's make a blanket statement. All men are fascinated by fighting.
I think so.
I think so.
A lot of women too.
But I think men they feel that they need to know how to fight. It's an essential skill set. And I think that if they don't learn it, it can develop into an insecurity.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Oh, for sure. And then
Yeah.
you get, I see it all the time, and you get people talking, a lot of guys, especially if they're sort of a little bit like athletic, like maybe they played high school football, or
Right.
they feel this need to kind of talk tough, and they start getting very uncomfortable when it gets into like, oh, well, I train, and they haven't trained, and
Right.
they sort of feel like, well, maybe I could still beat you in a fight. They sort of get like sort of uncomfortable, or they like
Right.
to sort of offer their opinions. Like a lot of guys will be like, are you crazy? Like, the top boxers would destroy the top MMA guys in an MMA match just because they're so much better,
right.
so much more athletic. And I'll be like, what are you basing this on? Like, you don't watch MMA.
Right, they
You
base
barely
it on-
watch boxing.
Right.
You don't know anything.
But everyone has an opinion. Don't you remember when
Yeah.
you were a young guy? In my neighborhood, my town, there was a lot of fighting. And there was essentially, I had a hierarchy in my mind of who the toughest people were. So-and-so, he's the toughest guy. He's the toughest guy in Rosendale. That's the town I grew up in. So you would regionalize it. He's the toughest guy in Rosendale. That guy's the toughest guy in West Roxbury or something like this. And you kind of had a pecking order of who the toughest guy was and who was the second toughest and so forth and so on. And it was always exciting if there was like the 1 and 2 guy might go into it, or the number 1 guy from here was going to fight the number 1 guy from there. And I almost sense that guys would try to. There was natural promoters. You know what I mean? There was guys who would try to instigate fights in order to iron out who was the superior fighter, who's number 2 and who's number 3.
Yeah. The funny thing, my difference is, I'd say I went to a town and a high school.
By the way, I wasn't on the
you
list
weren't
at
on
all.
You
No.
weren't on the pecking order.
No.
You weren't
No.
ranked. For my town, I'd say almost no one fought. There
Right.
was still a ranking,
Right.
but it was based on nonsense. It was
Well,
based on this guy's big, this guy's aggressive, this
Well,
guy's
that's
mean.
my whole point. It's a natural thing to
Yeah.
kind of create this pecking order. Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's a whole fascination about it. You're right. So
At
even
least
if
your
there's not
guys
actual
in your
fight-
town, they had to actually win a fight. Like in
They
my
actually did
town,
fight.
they just.
yeah, people actually smash each other's
And I guess
face
it's
yeah.
probably more common. More schools are probably like the town I grew up in now because they don't allow
think
fighting
so.
anymore.
Yeah, I think you're
Like,
right.
So, but I
Yeah.
bet they still have like, oh, I would not want to fight this guy, and they're talking about a guy who they've never seen fight and has
Right.
never been in a fight in his life probably.
right.
But he seems kind of mean or seems
Right.
kind of big.
So
So-
we all have this natural fascination with fighting. You sort of looked into it in college in kung fu, and you realized, this really isn't what I'm.
Right.
This isn't fighting.
Yeah,
this is
I'm not learning it.
something else. And then
And I
you-
used to feel like, again, even in the kung fu, which came back later, where like some guy, some more experienced guy would be sparring with me and like sort of maybe using his kung fu and slapping me on the head or something. And I'd be like, I always felt like, if you slap me again, I'm going to stop doing kung fu
And
I'm
punch
gonna
your
beat the
lights out.
crap out of you. Like,
Well, not to throw
throw you on the ground and just like,
right. But we should clarify. This isn't all kung fu. This is just
of course.
the kung fu at Cornell
Yeah.
University.
Yeah.
Kung fu.
Yeah,
class
there's
that you
super
took.
tough guys. There's super tough guys that do any martial
Well,
art.
there's
I mean,
also
yeah.
kung fu that is combat sports too.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, and Kung Lee. That's where
Yeah.
he came from, and he's an
Yeah.
amazing martial artist and
Yeah.
an amazing fighter.
Yeah, yeah.
And I
Yeah,
think
we're not here-
I think
I'm
he
not
would
here-
take you, Dan.
And Kung Lee? Well,
Yeah.
I don't know. He's older now. but yeah, of course.
so yeah, of course.
And there could be, again, there could have been tough guys in even in that class at Cornell.
Right,
Like that
absolutely.
could have won just because they were a tough guy or
Right.
athletic guy. Like,
Right.
But it was not really good technique to learn.
Wasn't
for
what you were
fighting.
looking for. So then,
So-
fast forward, you're in your 30s. What are you doing? Are you working? You're a father of 3.
Yeah.
You're working a job.
Yeah.
White
Cubicle.
collar job.
Cubicle. Yeah. So I didn't actually pursue martial arts. What happened was I brought my daughter in. I was like, she should, I guess, learn karate. There was karate was the closest thing in town. And I was like, it'll be good for her as a girl to learn to defend herself. And,
Right.
And they have a good karate program in the middle of Walpole. It's been there for like 25
To
years.
get
and-
confidence. And,
yeah, and they're just good instructors and they're friendly and
Right.
people like it. And so she was doing that, and they're great with the kids.
Yep.
And I was talking to the instructor and saying, talking about the UFC.
Yep.
And he said, I know some Brazilian jiu-jitsu.
Cool.
And he said, I could, on the side, like while your daughter's doing class, we could go into another room and you could learn Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Private. And I was like, oh, cool. Like, because I'm here anyway.
Yeah.
You know what I
very
mean?
Cool. Yeah.
I was like, perfect. In retrospect, he didn't know Brazilian jiu-jitsu was the
Right.
issue. But I didn't know that,
Oh,
I didn't know at the
yeah.
time. So he was like, he was teaching me Brazilian jiu-jitsu the way some of the kids karate program went. Like, if you learn these 2 sweeps, you get a blue belt. If you
Okay.
learn 2 more, you'll get a purple belt.
Right.
And you'll learn 3 more brown belt. Like, I could have been a black belt in jiu-jitsu in like a year and a half if I.
Right.
So
So when did it dawn on you that he didn't have the level of expertise that you thought he might initially?
It didn't dawn on me, except I still had that feeling. So even from there, so then he said, you could also learn karate here.
Okay.
So then I expanded what I was doing. So I was doing the jiu-jitsu and the karate all at this school.
Nice.
I like nice people there, good people there, but it was. And by the way, this is a school where the Florian brothers started their martial arts training.
Very cool.
Kenny and Keith. But you were learning forms,
Katas.
and
Yep.
and you weren't allowed to spar. And like if someone got hit, they'd get furious, and
Okay.
well,
they're trying to
be
keep it safe.
careful. And,
Yeah.
it was safe, and it was family oriented.
Yep.
So the thing is, I had that same feeling as in the kung fu class where I was like, but if I really want to beat you, I'll stop doing this karate
Right.
and I'd beat you up. Like,
Just start.
maybe
throwing
I'm not
some
saying
haymakers.
everyone, but like mostly that's how I felt.
Right.
And I might have told you the story once where I just was physically stronger than a guy in there who was like a black belt.
Okay.
But we allowed wrestling, or
Okay.
allowed, and I'm not a wrestler, but I was just physically,
So you were allowed to do some grappling.
in this
sparring.
one time, yeah.
Yep.
And so I just kind of threw him down, got on top of him, and I was like hovered over him, and he's like looking up at me, lying on his back, and he says, "Well, if I was allowed to do some other things, you'd be in big trouble right now." And I'm like, he's on his back. I'm looking down at
I
him.
know I appear completely helpless,
Yeah.
but what
And
you
I'm
don't
like-
realize,
So I
a
go
few
like,
more years of study, you'll
Yeah,
realize
yeah,
you're
like-
actually
yeah.
in big trouble, mister.
so I said to him, I'm kind of angry. I'm like, what would you do? And he's like, well, I could do like this. And he grabs my thumb and kind
Ooh.
of like
Ouch.
squeezes it like this painful way. And I was like, but I could hammer your face into jelly. Like, what? While you're squeezing my thumb, I could, you know what I mean? It's sort of like, that's what happens a lot where people say like in the street. I'm like, but if it was the street, I could gouge your eyes
Right.
out, or I could
Right.
I'm on top of you.
Right.
And so I had that same feeling where I'm like, everyone here, and he was one of the experienced black belts, and I was like, it's still not.
That's hilarious stuff. But let me back up just a little bit. So what gave you the impetus to start down this journey? I know you're saying you brought your daughter in, but I suspect you had something else inside of you that was going on.
I think it's the same thing that happened. Like, it's an offshoot of why I went in college. Like, it starts with this curiosity.
Right.
And like, doesn't anyone want to know? Like, first of all, don't you want to know how to defend yourself? Don't you want to know how to fight? And I remember being 14 and being told like to be a black belt, which to me at the time was a superhero, be like, it'll take 5 years. And at 14, you're like, well, that's forever.
Right.
At 30, in your 30s, you're like, well, wait, 5 years, I could do that. You
Right.
know that?
Yeah.
So I was thinking about it, and I was like, you know what? You're at that point in your 30s where it's like, I can go on to just become like the pot-bellied 40-year-old dad, or I could be a superhero in
Yeah.
5 years, And I was like, and it's not that hard. All of a sudden you realize in your 30s where you're like, wait, a 5-year journey is not that long,
Right.
and not that expensive, and I have the time. And
I started in my 30s as well. And I had 2 kids, and I had my own business, but it was a very white-collar business. And, I had a button-down shirt, I think, and a tie and, khakis or something, shoes.
Yeah.
And I would lift weights. I'd do all the boring stuff, bench press, and I'd go jogging with my business partner, Mark, great guy. And it was so tedious. But I started to lose touch. I played a lot of sports in high school. I was a football player and a wrestler. I wasn't a fighter in the streets, really. I was too busy with academics and sports and whatnot. But I was fascinated by fighting. A boxing fan back, Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali back in the 70s. And I did some boxing as a kid. But I was at that point where I had invested so much of my life into being a great husband, a great dad, and a great business person. So I was working so much, and I just felt like people started to look at me as this dowdy, boring business person, this boring dad. And I realized that there was a savage inside of me that I was losing touch with. And I said, I got to get that savage back. And and I think it was a January, so it was sort of a New Year's resolution thing. And I said, I'm going to finally do it, man. And I looked in the yellow pages, and it was in the late 90s, and the UFC was in my mind, and I knew Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in my mind was the most badass martial art. I'm like, I got to do whatever the most badass thing is, whatever that means. I don't even know what that means. And I found Boston Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was in the yellow pages over in Watertown. I went over there, took a class, and the moment I stepped on the mat, I felt like I had come home. And it was just awesome. And I started training immediately and as much as possible, and it was wonderful.
Yeah, but I think also that, so you came at it from a slightly different place.
I
though.
came at it from a place
you were
of-
pretty strong and athletic.
But I was feeling a lack. I was feeling a void in myself. I was feeling like I was losing touch with my identity. When the UFC first came out, I don't know if you know this, Dan, or you remember it. It was almost like pornography. Like you could go to, what was it, Blockbuster Video and rent them. But
they
it was
kind of
almost
eyeball
like
you. Yeah, exactly.
Like
it's almost like renting a porno.
it's
they
exactly
sort of
like renting a
looking
porno.
Like, okay.
Right,
Yeah,
you
you'd be like,
creep.
yeah.
Here you go, creep. And you're a dad. Yeah, it was really bad. So it was sort of like doing something dangerous. And
but as far as the way you started, I think it's two way. It's similar, but it's slightly different. That you were like, I'm losing touch
right
with something I had. I think there are people like I have friends that are even less athletic than me,
right,
less in shape than me, and they're sort of like, I'm trying to tell them like, you could actually learn enough to be able to beat the vast majority of people in a fight, and they sort of don't even believe me. They're sort of like,
I can see
me.
that.
They're like, me. I could never.
Well, when I was a kid, when I was a teenager doing the karate, my brother hung around with my brother's 2 years older than me, and he had a lot of guys who were super tough. Like the toughest guy in the town was Paul DeGrandis. His nickname was Kamungus. They'd say there's a Kamungus among us. And this guy was the scariest, hairiest. He's 13 years old. He had hair coming out of his back, his chest. He would wear, I hope he doesn't hear this because he might track me down
You're
and
still a little
wring my
scared.
neck. Oh, my God, yeah. He would wear a sweatshirt to the beach because he was so hairy. He felt self-conscious. And he was just a phenomenal force. I saw a guy take, you know what a crook lock is? It's two pieces of metal that slide together. It hooks to your brake and hooks to your steering wheel, old device to protect your car. I saw a guy take that, smash it over his head, and the thing break into two pieces. And then Kamungas just grab the guy and thrash him like a silverback gorilla killing somebody. So when I was taking karate, he would come up to me, okay, kick me. Try some of your karate, which of course I would never go near the guy. He was so scary. But yeah, those are the types of guys that we would see as fighters, and that's what we thought fighting was.
And that's who you think goes into the gym. Like, well,
right. That guy probably never trained fighting in his life. Well, he didn't need to. He was such a formidable
not to jump
person.
ahead, but we've seen. I'm sure you've seen many times people that come into the gym saying, "I'm a street fighter," or like I'm and I think you told me they pretty consistently don't do as well. Like they don't stick around as much, or they don't.
I've never seen a self-proclaimed street fighter come in and be able to do anything worth. Other than some of them have high pain tolerance. A lot of them are sadistic, so they don't mind being cruel to somebody else. But generally, they're not that good. And if somebody is getting in a lot of street fights, they probably have some impulse control issues, so they generally don't train long enough and consistently enough to develop real skills. That's that's a generalization, but I'm sure a lot of the really great fighters are natural fighters anyways.
Yeah.
If you ever read the book Cinderella Man,
I saw the movie.
you saw the movie.
Yeah.
It's a great movie, right?
Yeah.
So the villain in the movie is Max Baer, and in the book, he comes across as a more well-rounded character. Like he's kind of a happy-go-lucky guy in the book, and I think that's probably closer to life. But he started his boxing because he was in the Pacific Northwest, and him and his brothers were in a bar having fun, and they somehow started teasing some big lumberjack, and they got on the wrong side of this huge dude. 300-pound dude came over and started a fight with Max Baer, who said he'd never really been in a fight in his life. He goes, the guy started punching me, and in the middle of the fight, I realized his punches didn't hurt. So then I decided to hit him, and I hit him once and put him to sleep, like knocked him unconscious. So that guy's a natural fighter.
Yeah.
So he can naturally take a punch, naturally. And his brothers, it sounded like a Groucho Marx movie or a Marx Brothers movies. His brothers said, "You should be a prize fighter," and he like immediately became a
And that
professional
was, like,
fighter.
famous 100
Yeah,
years later.
and then like a year later was the world champion. So I'm probably abbreviating that story, but I think there are people out there like that. But back to your story, you weren't feeling so much a void in your life, but you still had curiosity about
Yeah.
fighting.
But then what started creeping up on me was the same feeling where I was like, so this is what's interesting too. In the karate gym, so it wasn't a great fit in that, for example, one example is that they'd be like, so who wants to learn nunchucks? And people are like, ooh, and I'd feel like, why in the world would I want to learn nunchucks?
Right.
Like, that's just not what I'm like, what? I have no, like, who wants to learn bow staff skills? And I'd be like, bow staff skills? I have no, like, you know what I mean? I have zero interest in that. Like,
Nunchucks, that's a 70s thing.
Yeah,
When I was a teenager, everybody had nunchucks and wanted
but
to
I
use
just
them.
feel like I'm not going to spend time.
Right.
I'd be like, we're not communicating here. I have no
Right.
interest in these things. This is not, and I think a lot of people there, I felt like they were playing, it was like Dungeons and Dragons for them. They're like,
Right.
I'm learning bow staff. And it's like, but you're not really you're like in fantasy land.
Right.
So what I wanted to say was that I found that I started questioning and being like, I don't know that what we're learning here would help me in a fight again.
Okay.
And then if some of the basic
Now,
jujitsu
this was
only,
in your karate place where you're
yeah.
doing a little karate, a little
Yeah.
jujitsu.
yeah.
Yep.
But so what was interesting is a lot of the guys, like I'm going to say a good half dozen of like the more maybe slightly younger meaning 30s and 20s and more athletic guys would were like, yeah, me too. Like I want to know if it really works. Like I want to know. So it seemed to be a common thing. There was this fantasy sort of thread going through all the training where like they tell tough guy stories. I don't know if you ever heard of a gym like this where they like the guy who was the head of the gym, not the local guy, but like the head of the whole organization.
Okay.
Was it's Fred Villari,
Oh, yeah.
and they tell these stories about the guy.
But his prowess.
Yeah, his prowess,
Okay.
and the stories were just like they tell a story that would leave the whole class going ooh, and I'd be like, that is the stupidest story I ever heard. Like
Give me an example. What happened?
I give you a perfect example.
Yeah.
They said Fred Villari, he would kick people between the legs.
In the groin.
Yeah, in the groin, and be like,
okay.
and he'd be like,
In
well,
the genitals.
yeah, no, they'd say he was good, and be like, but doesn't he hurt people? I'd be say, no. I asked Fred, how do you kick people in the groin without hurting them, like in practice? And he said, I stop when I feel testicle. It's like, and they'd be like, he has that kind of control.
Did
and
that-
and the
I
whole
wonder.
class would be like, amazing, and I'd be like, what? What are we?
Did that control apply to anything other than the testicle? Like, could he stop when he felt stomach or throat or something? It was purely
I
testicle.
assume, but then they tell another
They
story.
use the word testicle, Darren.
Yeah.
Are you embellishing?
Well, that's the word the guy used when he told the story.
That's the funniest thing I've ever heard in
And,
my life.
and then they told another story that was actually at odds with the first one, but it was the same kind of nonsense where they said, Fred cracked someone's skull. It caused some sort of damage. I think he actually cracked someone's skull was
Okay.
the story. And first of all, I was like, if he could stop when he felt testicle, he can't stop when he feels skull? Like what? So he like cracked someone's skull.
That was my previous question.
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
And then, but everyone looked right past that, and it was like, Fred, what happened? How'd you crack the skull? And then, like in awe, there's this pause, and he goes, "Well, Fred told me I accidentally let some of it out," and the whole class